Welcome to another episode of Judgment Date. As you know, these are programs that we've been running in lockdown to help people understand a range of questions, ranging to both the medical, the legal, and basically the economic issues which have been triggered by COVID-19, helping people through what are clearly very anxious and understandably difficult times. And today, it's a great pleasure to have Dr. Nic Spaull as a senior researcher at the University of Stellenbosch, because he's done, in a sense, two pieces of research, done many, but two pieces of research which intrigued me. One about the school closures, and two about, with other collaborators, about hunger in South Africa. And I want to talk to him about both. But Nic, thank you very much. Let's start with the school closures. You wrote a piece for the Daily Maverick in which you basically set out 6 reasons why schools should not be closed. The president clearly didn't agree with you, and within a short period of time, we found that the schools were closed. So let me go through this. I mean, let me ask you, I mean, your reaction presumably to that was something of frustration, I assume, because you put up 6 cogent reasons why, in fact, schools should remain open. I take it you stand by those still, notwithstanding what the president had to say.
Definitely. I mean, I set out those reasons because that's what I believe, and that's what I think the evidence is showing. So I don't agree with the decision to close the schools. I don't think that it's guided by the evidence or by science. I think it was a political decision. So I don't get too frustrated with these sorts of things because it's not in my control. I mean, if you got frustrated with things that weren't in your control, I think I'd probably be dead by now. So I just kind of focused on put the evidence on the table, get it out there in as an accessible way as possible. But then ultimately it's the president's and his cabinet's decision. They're the elected officials. They must make that decision and live with the consequences.
Okay, your philosophical attitude, this is commendable, and I hope that everybody listening to this will share that broad philosophical view of life under COVID-19. But can I just go through some of the reasons, because I'd like to debate them with you. The one which obviously everybody talks about is the question of the health question. And I suppose what I'm asking is, there's a hell of a debate going on in the United States of America at the moment about opening of schools, and there, you know, there seem to be two sensible, I'm not talking about Donald Trump now, but there do seem to be those people who think schools should be closed, who are actually quite sensible and sane, and include a whole lot of pediatricians and scientists. Why would there be a difference between their approach to that situation, our approach here?
Sure. So some of this has to do with when we entered our lockdown and when northern countries entered their lockdowns. So Martin Gustafsson wrote a great op-ed also for the Daily Maverick on, I think it was titled something like, "What is the World Health Organization actually saying about school closures?" And he shows that South Africa entered our lockdown period far earlier in our trajectory than any of these other countries in the northern areas did. So our kids have not been in school for nearly 3 months at the moment. And, you know, we're going to go into a 4th and a 5th month, depending on which grade you're in. So we're in a different ball game to where they are. They're in that first month of saying, you know, we got to this late. When are we deciding to close schools? So that would be the first one, is kind of figuring out where we are compared to comparable countries. And I think that even the American Pediatric Association, their official position is that schools should open and that teachers and children need to practice social distancing, which is the same as the South African Pediatrics Association, which is the same as Prof. Salim Abdul Karim, the head of the Ministerial Advisory Committee. I think there are no epidemiologists that I'm aware of in South Africa that think it's the right decision to close schools.
But then let me ask you, is that all schools? Because what I suppose, one of the things that COVID-19 has shown, and I'm going to get onto that when we talk about the research with regard to hunger and the effects thereof, is the unbelievable fissures in our society, in the sense in which race, class have so, well, we all knew that, but my goodness, let's just put a microscope on those cleavages. And I mean, there are schools which are in terrible shape, and, you know, it would be difficult to do the social distancing in them. Is there some sense in which there would be some schools where you'd have to do, where you'd have to think slightly differently, where there'd be some nuance to the policy, or would one have all the schools open?
No, definitely. I mean, I think that a one-size-fits-all approach is never going to work in South Africa, given the types of inequalities that we have. And one area where I completely agree with the teacher unions is that schools need to have basic protective equipment, things like masks and hand sanitizer, and that they need toilets and running water, some kind of water for teachers to use to practice basic sanitation. If they don't have that, teachers should not be expected to go back to those schools. That's not the majority of schools. That's less than 30% of schools that have those problems. So we're talking about 70% of schools that could go back. The social distancing one is more difficult because of class sizes, and large class sizes are quite widespread in South Africa. But this points to another part of the evidence that I think is relevant, which is it's not just about the number of students, right? Children are not affected by this virus in the same way as adults. That's now very clear. So if we take schools in the Western Cape and schools in Gauteng, these are the two provinces with the largest number of infections. We don't have to look to hypotheses anymore. There's actually data on this. So if you look in Gauteng, of teachers, about 0.8% of teachers have been infected with COVID.
But when was this? I mean, sorry, can I just ask you, from a point of complete ignorance, was this testing the classes that have already gone back? Is that what
Yes.
The data that we've got?
Yes.
So grade 12. Sorry, it's not to interrupt you. That's what I just want to clarify. Yes.
So there's two things. One is in many schools, all the teachers went back, not just the teachers who were teaching the kids. I mean, whether that happened in practice, that was theoretically what was meant to be happening. So even if they weren't teaching, they were expected to go back to school and prepare for when their learners were coming back. So we have evidence from the Western Cape. So we experienced our surge. I'm based in Cape Town. We experienced our surge while schools were open, at least for grade 7 and grade 12, right? So the largest number of new daily cases was happening while schools were open. And there's a helpful circular that the MEC for Basic Education put out that listed all of the data in terms of how many teachers had been infected, how many learners had been infected, etc. Same stats, less than 1% of teachers that had been infected. I think it's something like 24 teachers that had died of COVID-19. Now, that's not zero, but we must remember that there are also all of the other professions where some people are dying of COVID-19, which is a tragedy. Any death from COVID-19 or any death is a tragedy, of course. But that's not the question that we're asking here. We're trying to say, are teachers at more risk than any other person that's going back to work? And the answer is no, they're not.
They say, as I understand it, well, we didn't sign up for this, unlike health workers.
But it's not just health workers, right? So health workers are at something like 800 times the risk of teachers. So yes, nurses and doctors and administrators in hospitals are at far higher risk of getting infected with COVID-19. When we're comparing teachers, we're comparing them to any other government official. We're comparing them to any other retail worker or someone who works in a shopping center or any other job that you have to interact with other adults. That's the category that we are talking about when we're talking about teachers. So I think just yesterday there was an interview where Prof. Salim Abdul Karim said that, if you think that teachers are at higher risk, you should actually say everything needs to close because they are at the same risk as every other person that has now gone back to work.
So what you're saying is that basically that argument, the health argument, is in fact not one that's sustained by the science that's available to us at present.
Correct.
What about the argument, which I understand, I think Professor Alexander from the University of Johannesburg, I think I'm right, arguing that, 60% of the parents don't want their kids back at school.
So I think there are two things there. The first is that no one has forced any parent to send their child back to school, right? So the official position of the minister and the president was, if you do not feel comfortable to send your child to school, keep them at home. You are well within your rights to do that. What I have an issue with is when the law prevents parents who do feel that their school is equipped and that what is in the best interest of their child is to go to school, which is adjudicated by the parent, that we are preventing them from doing that. So that's the first one. No one is forcing parents to send their children to school. The second one is that we have to be careful about extrapolating from samples. So the sample that they are referring to is an online survey of parents and adults. Now, the types of people that respond to those sorts of surveys are not the same as the people that don't respond. So survey non-response and representativity and all of those sorts of things. And I understand that they did try and reweight things to try and make it more representative of South Africa. But representativity is something that we take very seriously in economics. And I think that there are some questions around that. I don't think that that's a particularly authoritative stat on the parents that want to send their children back to school. And the data that the ministers presented disagrees with it. When you look at the people that actually sent their kids back to school in grade 12 and grade 7.
So then moving on, the other issue, which is really, before I get to the other issue, let me ask you this. One of the points you raised was the effect on children. And I'd just like to discuss that with you for 2 minutes. I mean, this is presumably going to be a disaster for the inequalities which essentially are really patterning out in South Africa, because presumably many of the private schools, I don't know what they're doing, but I assume that in the private schools, even if they're not back physically, their kids have probably got more access to internet and computers than many of the kids in the public schools. So the levels of inequality are only going to be exacerbated. I mean, am I right in that? And what are the effects going to be for our education going forward?
Sure. So I think if schools are closed, this is the worst form of exacerbating inequality, right? Because parents that have access to technology, the internet, private tuition, those sorts of things, their kids will carry on learning. And they're also in middle class environments where parents can help, compared to the poor that have very, very little access to learning technologies. To give you some stats, the General Household Survey showed that only 20% of households in South Africa have a computer. Only 10% have a household internet connection. So how are you meant to be doing any kind of e-learning whatsoever in 80% of households? And watching television and listening to the radio does not compete with trying to kind of learn additional things in the curricula, which is why we say that when schools are closed, for 80% of learners, all curricular learning has stopped. So you're right in saying it will be devastating for these children who will lose out on between half and another year of their learning, and that will follow them for the rest of their lives. I said to someone the other day, I think that the COVID kids will be the new OBE kids. In universities, I don't know if you experienced this, Dennis, but you could tell when students were coming in that went through the OBE curriculum, they had a very different type of education compared to regular curriculum. And you could tell they needed a hell of a lot more support than all of the others. I suspect we're going to see a similar thing with COVID, but that it's going to be unequally distributed.
Could I ask you, by the by, I mean, whether in fact, your figure of 20 and 10%, is that something just going forward that we could, is there a way in which government could be providing tablets or some form of electronic mechanisms for children, computers, etc., on a wider scale? I know many countries do that, the developing countries. Why have we not done?
In my view, that would be a disaster.
Okay.
So I think that there is no evidence that providing educational technology substitutes for teaching or education. So what the evidence that there is shows that technology can supplement and support good teaching when it's done well. It cannot replace a teacher. Everywhere where they've tried to do this, and for those that are interested in a summary of this, if you look for 10 priorities for education, this is a report that I did for Presidency and Treasury. I just summarized the evidence from all the different international countries that have tried this. And by the way, this is not just developing countries that fail. This is like Los Angeles that had to renege on a $1 billion contract with Apple because it never got implemented. These are much more sophisticated education systems than ours that just cannot manage it whatsoever. But the Eastern Cape is not trying it.
I know. When I read about the Eastern Cape and the controversies, I'm not suggesting for one moment the Daily Maverick article is inaccurate by any stretch, but of course we haven't, had a forensic investigation into it, but leave aside the merits of whether they're overpaid or not. You suggesting that particular initiative is not a substitute in any way for what we have to do, which is get kids into a classroom facing qualified teachers.
Definitely, but even if you made the decision, okay, schools are closed, there's nothing that we can do about that now for a month. What we do? Must we just sit and wait? I would say no, but use that 500 million rand or billion rand or whatever it was to provide things like graded readers to children, books to send home to children that they can read with their parents. There are certain types of educational materials that could be sent home to children for them to do that we're not doing, that cost money. but that would be a much better use of those sorts of resources compared to buying a whole bunch of tablets and thinking that somehow this magically makes the matrics ready.
Okay, so then getting on to a point which is the segue between your one piece of research and the other, is this issue of meals at schools. And what shocked me was reading, in fact, indeed, a report again in the Daily Maverick of a judgment given in Gauteng, which I then went to take the trouble to read thereafter, in which it appeared that all of the provinces other than the Western Cape were not providing children with meals for schools other than grades 7 and 12. Now, the scheme itself seems to be an incredibly good scheme.
Mm.
So what is the reason? I mean, why on earth was it that I mean, that doesn't require, let me put it this way, that doesn't require schools to be open. They could do that anyway, surely.
Well, so let's give you a sense of the scale of how big this feeding scheme is. So the official term is called the National School Nutrition Project, yes. NSNP. We just call it free school meals usually. And it feeds during Monday to Friday when schools are open, it feeds 9 million children every single day. Okay. So that's about 75% of all kids that go to school from grade R all the way up to grade 12 are getting these free school meals.
And does that mean kids who presumably whose parents could afford to provide meals for them and ones who can't?
Yeah, so you don't, the way that the school meal happens is the school would offer it to all the children in no-fee schools, which are essentially 75%. If children bring their own lunches, which some of the wealthier kids in poorer schools do, they don't have to eat it, of course. But essentially in fee charging schools, they don't have this program really. It's primarily for no-fee schools.
Good. So 9 million odd, yeah.
9 million children receive that meal every single day. So, I mean, if you look at this relative to the population of South Africa, someone was doing a calculation the other day and they said, 1 in 6 meals that gets eaten in South Africa, Monday to Friday, is one of these meals.
Cool. And that's an achievement. I mean,
it's a massive achievement. And there's even been a review, there's been an evaluation that the Department of Basic Education initiated. I think the Department of Planning, Monitoring and Evaluation implemented it with JET, was the evaluation agency. And they found that by and large, it does happen. It happens when it's meant to happen. The nutrition quality, like there's certain rooms for improvement, but by and large, it's a really successful program. Okay. So the way that school feeding happens is there's usually 2 or 3 cooks that are hired on a kind of EPWP level, maybe 3,000 Rand a month type of thing, that they cook. And then at some point in the day, usually sort of 9, 10, children go and within their classrooms, usually they would get this meal. It all gets dished out and they all eat it and then they carry on with their learning. Now, if you've got 800 kids in a school, 3 cooks are not going to be able to manage the feeding scheme for 800 children. Right? In terms of managing very young children, getting them to wait, getting to be in line, making sure that they social distance, etc. During the regular time, teachers are an integral part of making the school feeding scheme work. Yeah. So you would not be able to implement this program in 25,000 schools without the 400,000 teachers that are normally there to help administer it, right? So if teachers are not going to school and not teaching, are they now going to be at school but just doing school feeding? In which case you've got all the kids there, you've got all the teachers there. In my mind, that's kind of regular schooling. Like you're not minimizing any risk from COVID, even though it was a very low risk. The second one to think about is school transport. So many children get dropped off in the morning and then collected in the afternoon. So what happens now? Do all these kids get dropped off, the taxi waits, they all get back in and then they go back to their home? The Western Cape managed to get around this a little bit by saying that children could collect meals from whatever their closest school was, whether it was their school or not. That's going to be really difficult in a lot of other provinces. So it's going to be interesting to see how people comply with this judgment. But I think it's a further reason for me of why schools should have stayed open, and that more emphasis should have been put on the PPE and making schools safe.
So are you saying that the judgment, at the time the judgment was delivered and the order was granted, it seemed that then the teachers for grades 7 and 12 were at school, but the idea was that other kids would get a meal. I don't know whether that was supposed to mean that they could pick the meal up or what have you. But
so my understanding,
the idea was that I suppose parents could come and fetch meals for their children. I don't know.
Well, my understanding of that is that that's actually not within the realm of the court to dictate. What the court and the judge was saying is that 9 million children rely on these meals not to be hungry. The department cannot withhold these meals. They have been budgeted for. Families and children are relying on them. You have to find a way of continuing to provide this essential good to these children, whether or not schools are open.
And your argument is that unless the children are there, how on earth are they going to get how on earth are they going to get the meal? And for many, many kids in rural areas, etc., I'm not quite sure how they get dropped off.
That, and secondly, I think that de facto what's going to end up happening is schools are going to be open, but just for feeding, not for learning. So the department, if the department says it has to comply with this, and the president in his announcement, his proclamation that schools were going to be closed, mentioned that the school feeding thing will happen. So I think when now provinces are needing to implement this and they're thinking, well, how do we feed 9 million children? Sending home food parcels to 9 million households or 6 million households is a logistical nightmare. So what are they going to do? Children must come to the school, they must collect it. Okay, what does that mean? It means you have to have school staff there to manage the process. Okay, what does that mean? All the teachers must come back.
Okay, I got the point. And absent that, these children starve.
No, I mean, that's, I think that's probably overstating it. So we have data on that. Oh, sure, definitely.
But let me go to your data. Let me go to your data, your the other research that you did. If, as I understand it, that there were extraordinary cohorts of people in your sample who reported that at least one of their people that they knew in their household was hungry, once every 5 or 7 days, or whatever the case was. I mean, it seemed to me, reading that research, extraordinary levels of hunger. Surely that would include these children.
Yes, and we did actually look at child hunger. So I can explain that in a moment.
Please,
I don't know if I'm able to share my screen. But the gist of that study was, so this is called the National Income Dynamics Study Coronavirus Rapid Mobile Survey, or we call it NIDS-CRAM, so we don't have to mention that whole thing each time. Okay?
For a simple term, yes.
And what this was because no in-person surveys were possible during the lockdown, but yet we knew there was going to be a significant amount of job loss, income loss, hunger, all of these devastating consequences of the lockdown, yet we wouldn't have any data on what was going on. So we implemented a program. This is across 30 researchers from 6 universities. We got permission from Presidency to use the National Income Dynamics Study, NIDS, which is a well-known study that was a sample of South African households. And we telephone surveyed using 50 call center agents, approximately 7,000 of these from the breadth and depth of South Africa. That's broadly nationally representative. Okay, currently it's the only kind of broadly nationally representative sample or survey that's been done in South Africa. And one of the areas that was asked within that survey is about hunger. It's not the only one. We also asked about job loss. We also asked about income loss, etc. And I'm sure we'll get to that in a moment. The 3 million job losses, 2 million of these were women, various other things. But on the hunger part, to focus on that, one of the questions that we asked is, in the month of April, so we were surveying them in May and June, and we asked them, in the month of April, which was the peak lockdown, the hard lockdown period, did your household run out of money to buy food? And 47% of respondents said that their household had run out of money to buy food. So half of South African households, basically. Now, when we asked them another follow-up question and we said, okay, in the last 7 days, has anyone in your household gone hungry because there was not enough food? 22% of respondents, so about 1 in 5, respondents said that someone in the household had gone hungry in the last 7 days, which is a very acute measure of hunger. Normally, surveys would ask about the last month or the GHS the last year. Has anyone gone hungry? And these rates in the last 7 days are much, much higher. We're talking 3-4 times as high as the yearly rate of hunger in 2018, for example. We also asked about child hunger. In the last 7 days, has any child in your household gone hungry? And obviously, we only ask this if there's a child in the household. 15% of respondents said that a child had gone hungry in the last 7 days. So the difference in those two, 22% and 15%, some of that has got to do with shielding, parents protecting their children from hunger. So they go hungry, but the children don't. And to answer your question about the perpetual hunger, are children starving? 4% of households where there was a child in them said that a child was going hungry almost every day or every day. Now, if you look at that, we're talking about millions of children when you're referring to those numbers, right? These are not small numbers. That 15% of households, when you're talking about more than 15 million children, we're talking of very large numbers of children. And yes, then you could extrapolate and say some of those children would be so severely malnourished that they would be starving.
Can I just ask one methodological question? I mean, how did you get hold of these people? I mean, what sort of method?
So the NIDS data has the cell phone numbers of the participants that they would normally visit in person, right? And normally you would drive out and visit them and with a little clipboard or whatever and fill it out. It's actually a tablet, and you'd fill it out. Now we just phone them. So we hired a service provider who has 50 call center agents in 10 languages. Wave 2 is now 11 languages because we're following these same people across 5 waves. And you phone them and you administer a 20-minute questionnaire. So I'd say, hi, Dennis. Hi, I'm phoning from NIDS. You remember we came and visited your household in 2017. Are you willing to participate in the survey, consent, all of that sort of stuff? And then we would ask them a set of questions. And it takes about 20 minutes.
Okay. So what we've really got is what Amartya Sen made his name on, which is that there's enough food in the country, but we're not distributing it to people who need it.
Definitely. I mean, this is a much bigger issue, right? I mean, there's conversations now about basic income grant, and we need a distributive politics rather than just a productive politics.
I suppose the question I'm asking is, I mean, we're sitting here with an unbelievable level of hunger and people in desperate circumstances. Clearly, we're not doing enough. I mean, if we were going to do one thing, what would we do other than the schools? I understand that, get the 9 million meals back. But other than that, what can we do to as we alleviate what is utter disaster from the research that you've just described and which you published?
Sure. So I think the first one to recognize is that the massive constraint that families are facing is income loss. So 3 million people in South Africa lost their jobs between February and April, and a further 1.5 million.
Can I stop you? I assume we could safely extrapolate saying that has continued to be the case subsequent to April.
So it could have come down because that was hard lockdown, and we've come out of hard lockdown.
Yeah, but we're not back to anywhere near what we should be, as a result of which is, no. I mean, restaurants and the tourism industry and many other industries are still locked down. I mean, we know that all sorts of restaurants are closing, so presumably all sorts of people are losing their job.
So again, here's the nice thing is that this is a panel survey. We don't need to speculate on this. If you wait for a month, we can tell you the answer to that question.
Oh, good. We'll have you back and talk about it then. Okay, very good. Yeah.
So, but let me tell you some of the high level.
I interrupted you. Yeah, I interrupted you. You said 3 million until April, who presumably have not got back.
No. So between February and April, we asked them, did you have a job? Did you have any income, etc. In February, we asked them the same questions in April. Now, we have a category of workers in South Africa that are furloughed workers. So they say they do have a job to go back to, but they had no income. So 3 million people reported that they lost their job completely. They reported that they did not have a job to go back to. A further 1.5 million said that they were furloughed. In other words, they had zero income, but they said they did have a job to go back to. So if you think of someone like a domestic worker who might not have been paid during the lockdown, but that they expected they would be able to go back to their employer who would presumably pay them afterwards, for the despicable people that did not pay their domestic workers during the lockdown.
Shocking, I know.
Totally shocking. But I think one thing to emphasize here, those 3 million jobs were born predominantly by the poor. So if you look at job loss and kind of who were the people that were losing jobs, only 5% of the wealthy, so those earning more than 24,000 Rand a month, lost their jobs, compared to 38% of the poor, those earning less than 3,000 Rand. If you include the furloughed workers, it's more than 50% of people that earn less than 3,000 Rand that lost their jobs and their income. So it's half of all workers that earn less than 3,000 Rand a month lost all of their income. Now, that has major knock-on effects for things like food poverty, hunger, the ability to provide for your family. But Dennis, I would actually have a question for you, and I'll use this opportunity to ask you with your legal background and as a judge. So, this new COVID grant, 350 Rand COVID grant for the unemployed. At the moment, up until the end of June, there was a SASSA presentation to NEDLAP And they showed that 2/3 of those grants that had been paid out up until the end of June had been paid to men, not women, despite the fact that 2/3 of job losses were women. Okay, so there's a huge mismatch here. And I think the reason is that the COVID-19 grant says that you're not eligible for it if you have another grant. Okay, and a lot of women have the child support grant. So the question, and I've actually asked a few ex-constitutional court judges about this who I sit on boards with, and they agree with me on this, which is that the child support grant is actually received on behalf of the child, not for the benefit of the mother, it's for the benefit of the child. In which case, women are being discriminated against. In other words, you're not allowed to get the COVID-19 grant because you've got the CSG, but the CSG is received for the child, not for the mother. So this is, in my view, actually a constitutional case that one of these strategic litigation people should take up, because women are bearing the brunt of this crisis, and yet they're not receiving the benefits of that COVID-19 grant because they have children.
It's a pretty compelling argument, which I assume one of the NGOs probably will take up. But let me ask you on that. About a week ago, I had Colin Coleman on this program on these things, and he was talking about a basic income grant which could provide a whole host of people with over 1,000 rands a month if on a fiscally neutral way. It does seem to me that 350 is totally parsimonious. We need to expand that if we possibly can, surely.
Yes, so I've read, he published an op-ed in the Daily Maverick showing where he would get all of those billions from, because the big question is not, do you support it? All sensible people, I think, are saying basic income grant would be great. I was just reading this, I'm teaching later today, this book, Give a Man a Fish.
It's a wonderful book, by the way. Yes.
It's a wonderful book. And to speak to my class about this, because about distributive politics.
Good on you for teaching that,
And I think it points to this idea of a basic income grant. And I think in my Financial Mail op-ed a while ago about these 3 million job losses, it's the only silver lining that I can see from all of this, is that COVID-19 forces us to grapple with these really unacceptable inequalities and injustices and historical injustices that remain, where wealth and income are so unequally distributed that people are being forced into absolute abject poverty while we are living comfortably. And that feels wrong, morally wrong. And I think that something like a basic income grant would recognize that this is not based on the fact that people are poor or that they've lost a job. It's actually based on the fact that they are citizens of a country and that they have basic dignity that needs to be protected. And providing that income, I think, is the critical thing. The question is where you get the money from.
Well, that we got to find, but the answers, I mean, he certainly...
And your tax commission must find it.
No, well, I'm not sure we can find it through the tax commission, Nick, but I mean, I understand that. I think there is some money there, but it also depends how you prioritize expenditure. And it seems to me that the proposition that you're putting to me throughout this discussion is that has to be the first priority. I mean, there can be no greater priority than the fact that we have to have expenditure to ensure that the poorest of the poor actually live without going to bed hungry every night. I mean, that seems to me to be an absolute no-brainer, surely.
Definitely. I think something Michael Sachs said to me a while ago, which has always stuck with me, was, and this was actually pre-COVID, was we need to tighten our belt in terms of the fiscal situation in South Africa, but the poorest 60% should not fit the bill. They should not feel it. We have to find a way of squaring the circle and making the books balance, but the poor should not be the ones that are expected to pay for it. It has to be the wealthiest 20%. And I completely agree with that.
Yeah, I think that's right. And I think that, and in a sense, that seems to me much of what your research is actually pointing to is that that's the cohort that we are leaving behind, because 350 Rand may be commendable initiative, but it's surely not enough to keep body and soul together. That's really, given the research that you're talking about. So
definitely. I mean, it's the same with the child support grant, that it's not going to get children out of even food poverty if you think that there are 2 children in the household, and these top-up grants are per caregiver, not per child. So they're getting 500 Rand top-up that they must split across the 2 or 3 children that they have.
Well, I'm afraid I've run out of time because there were many other issues that I wanted to ask you about, but I think there's a lot here which we can talk about. And when you've done your next research on this, we'll get you back to talk further about it, because I think what your research showed, for me, certainly was it shone a light on a whole lot of factors, particularly the research on hunger and jobs, which in a sense were almost falling through the cracks and shouldn't have been. So Nic Spaull, thank you very much for an extraordinarily enlightening a discussion about issues which unfortunately are both enlightening and incredibly depressing. So you probably depressed me and the rest of the country, but we should be depressed in order that we should do something. Thanks very much.
And there's no alcohol anymore, so you can't even
I
buy
know,
alcohol
can't even
for
get
this.
drunk. Thank you very much. Take
Okay,
care.
thanks, Dennis.